Section 78204 Florida statute.
I'll plead not guilty right now.
And your grand jury is being...
The most evil home, invasion killers. When evil breaks into your one safe place, home is supposed to be the final barrier, the place where the world ends and safety begins. A locked door, a familiar hallway, a bed where nothing bad is meant to reach you. But sometimes that boundary fails. Sometimes evil does not wait outside. It steps quietly across the threshold. It learns routines. It watches lights go out. And when the moment comes, it enters a space where fear is least expected. The cases in this documentary are not about chance encounters or crimes of opportunity in public places. They are about intrusion, about what happens when violence breaks into bedrooms, living rooms, and hallways that once felt secure. Each story begins the same way: a normal night, a closed door, and the belief that nothing bad can happen here. Before we continue, if you choose to stay with these stories, supporting the channel with a like and a subscription helps keep this series going. Thank you for being here. Tallahassee, Florida, January 15th, 1978. The Chi Omega sorority house near Florida State University was never intended to function as a barrier against danger. It was a shared living space, designed for openness rather than security. Dozens of young women lived there, moving freely through hallways and common rooms. Doors were unlocked as a matter of routine. Safety was assumed, not questioned. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, that assumption failed. Ted Bundy had arrived in Tallahassee only weeks earlier. At that time, he was already one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States. He had escaped custody twice in Colorado and crossed state lines to avoid capture. His life had narrowed to survival and movement. He slept where he could. He blended in where possible. The discipline that once governed his crimes was eroding, but the compulsion driving them remained. Bundy approached the Chi Omega house shortly before dawn. There was no forced entry that shattered the silence, no broken window, no kicked door. The building was accessible by design, and Bundy exploited that fact. He entered quietly, moving into a structure where residents were asleep and unprepared for intrusion. Once inside, Bundy navigated the house deliberately. He did not bring a weapon with him. Instead, he picked up a piece of wood from within the house. The choice reflected reliance on proximity and surprise rather than planning. The house itself became part of the attack. Margaret Bowman was asleep in her bedroom when Bundy entered. There was no warning and no opportunity to react. Medical testimony later confirmed that the injuries inflicted were severe and immediately life-threatening. Bowman died in her bed, inside a room meant for rest and privacy. Bundy did not leave the house after the first attack. He moved through the hallway into another bedroom. Lisa Levy was attacked next. The assault was prolonged. Medical experts later testified that the injuries inflicted required sustained force and close contact. This was not a single blow delivered in panic. It was repeated violence carried out in a confined space where escape was nearly impossible. Levy died from her injuries inside the same house, only rooms away from other residents who were still asleep. As Bundy continued moving through the house, the environment began to change. Sounds carried through the building. Movement stirred. Confusion replaced sleep. Some residents awoke, unsure of what they were hearing or where it was coming from. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were also attacked. Both survived, but sustained serious injuries that required extensive medical treatment and long-term recovery. Their survival became critical to understanding how the attacks unfolded. They described confusion, darkness, and the realization that someone dangerous had already entered their living space. Bundy fled the house before police arrived. Within hours, the Chi Omega house was sealed as a crime scene. Investigators documented bedrooms, hallways, and shared spaces that had been transformed in a single night. Blood evidence marked the locations of the attacks. Personal belongings remained exactly where residents had left them, underscoring how abruptly ordinary life had been interrupted. Less than an hour after leaving the sorority house, Bundy entered another nearby residence. Cheryl Thomas was asleep when he attacked her. Once again, he crossed into a private space without resistance or warning. Thomas survived, but suffered severe injuries that required extensive medical care and permanent rehabilitation. The proximity in time and location between the attacks made clear that this was not a random incident. Bundy was moving through residential areas, entering homes where people believed they were safe enough to sleep. Law enforcement launched an intensive manhunt. Witness accounts, physical evidence, and Bundy's known status as an escaped fugitive quickly narrowed the focus. When he was arrested weeks later, the events at the Chi Omega house became the central pillar of the prosecution. At trial, survivors testified about waking to violence, about confusion and darkness, and about realizing that danger had already crossed the threshold. Medical professionals explained the injuries in controlled, factual language, focusing on force, proximity, and sequence rather than sensational detail. Prosecutors emphasized that Bundy relied on access rather than force. He did not need to break down doors. He entered a place where trust replaced caution. The openness of the house was not a flaw. It was simply exploited. The jury returned guilty verdicts for the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. Ted Bundy was sentenced to death. For the women who lived at Chi Omega, the house could never return to what it once was. Bedrooms were no longer neutral spaces. Hallways carried memory. Shared trust was replaced by awareness. The Tallahassee attacks became one of the most infamous moments in American criminal history, not because they happened in public view, but because they happened in a place built on familiarity and safety. On January 15, 1978, a private space was violated. Nothing inside it was ever the same again. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, June 2005. The Groween family home stood on a quiet residential street in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Trees lined the road. Other family houses sat nearby, close enough that lights could be seen through windows at night. It was not an isolated property, not hidden from view. It was a place shaped by routine, where evenings ended with doors closed and mornings began without fear. Inside lived a family who believed that once the night settled in, nothing from the outside could reach them. On a summer night in June 2005, that belief was destroyed. Joseph Edward Duncan did not arrive at the Grown home impulsively. Court records later showed that he had been watching the neighborhood for days. He observed patterns, when cars came and went, when lights were turned off, when the street grew quiet enough to allow movement without attention. He waited for a moment when the house would be still. Late that night, Duncan entered the Groen home. There was no forced entry that immediately alerted anyone inside. No shattered glass, no loud crash. The intrusion was quiet, allowing him to cross into the house without resistance. Inside were several members of the Groen family, asleep in their bedrooms, unaware that someone had already entered their space. What followed unfolded rapidly and with overwhelming force. Duncan moved through the home, attacking the occupants while they slept. The violence was direct and sustained. Medical testimony later confirmed that 3 members of the Groen family were killed inside the house. The attacks occurred in close quarters, leaving little opportunity for escape or defense. Bedrooms became confined spaces where the violence ended lives within moments. The layout of the house worked against the family. Narrow hallways, closed doors, familiar spaces turned into traps. The attacks were not scattered or chaotic. They were concentrated, carried out room by room, inside a place that offered no warning and no protection. 7-year-old Dylan Groen survived. Despite suffering severe injuries, Dylan managed to escape the house. He made his way outside, disoriented and bleeding, and reached a neighbor's home. Covered in blood and visibly wounded, he told them that his family had been attacked. His condition made the urgency unmistakable. Emergency services were called immediately. Inside the Groen home, first responders encountered a scene that confirmed a deliberate home invasion. Bedrooms had been transformed into crime scenes. Blood evidence marked where the attacks occurred. There was no sign of theft or random destruction. The violence had been purposeful, carried out with intent rather than panic. One absence stood out immediately. 8-year-old Shasta Groen was missing. It became clear that the crime did not end inside the house. Shasta had been taken. The home invasion had escalated into an abduction, extending the violation far beyond the walls where it began. What started in the bedrooms now reached beyond the neighborhood and into unknown territory. Law enforcement launched an immediate and expansive response. The home was secured, evidence was processed, roadways were monitored, alerts were issued across Idaho and neighboring states. The case drew national attention almost instantly, driven by the brutality of the murders and the urgency of locating a missing child. Joseph Edward Duncan was not unknown to authorities. His criminal history included previous offenses involving violence and exploitation. Investigators quickly recognized patterns that aligned with the growing case. Those connections allowed them to narrow their focus and prioritize the search. Days later, Duncan was stopped during a routine traffic stop in Montana. Inside the vehicle was Shasta Groen. She was alive. Her recovery marked the end of the immediate search and the beginning of a long legal process. Duncan was taken into custody and extradited to Idaho to face charges that reflected the full scope of his actions. At trial, prosecutors presented a detailed reconstruction of the night. They described how Duncan entered the home, how the attacks unfolded, and how Shasta was taken from the scene. Medical experts testified about the injuries sustained by the victims, explaining how quickly the violence unfolded and how little opportunity there was to respond. Forensic evidence placed Duncan inside the Groen residence beyond dispute. Physical traces, witness testimony, and his own history formed a consistent narrative that left little room for doubt. The jury also heard about what happened after the home invasion. Shasta Groen later testified in court, describing captivity following the attack. Her testimony revealed how the crime extended beyond the house, continuing into days of confinement. The violation did not end when the door closed behind Duncan. It followed her. Throughout the trial, the focus remained on the invasion of the home itself. Prosecutors emphasized that the family had been attacked while asleep, inside a place meant to protect them. The crime relied on silence, timing, and vulnerability rather than confrontation. Duncan was convicted of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and related charges. He received the death penalty in Idaho, along with multiple life sentences connected to the case. For the Groen family and their extended relatives, the house could never return to what it had been. The structure still stood, but its meaning was permanently altered. Rooms once associated with family life became inseparable from loss. The crime left a lasting impact on the community. It challenged assumptions about safety and proximity. It showed how quickly a familiar space could be transformed, and how little warning such a violation could bring. Joseph Edward Duncan entered the Groen home when everyone inside was most vulnerable and acted before anyone could respond. But he was not the last one to do so. On a summer night in Idaho, a family home was violated. Wichita, Kansas, December 15, 2000. The house stood on a quiet residential street in Wichita, Kansas. It was not isolated. Other homes were close by. Cars were parked along the road. From the outside, it looked like a place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Inside were 5 people who believed they were spending an ordinary night among friends. On December 15, 2000, that belief was destroyed. Reginald Carr and his younger brother Jonathan had already committed violent crimes earlier that night. By the time they arrived at the house on East Birchwood Drive, violence was no longer an escalation. It was already part of their momentum. The home was not chosen because of who lived there, but because it was accessible. They forced their way inside. Once the door was breached, control was immediate. The occupants were restrained and moved through the house under threat. What had been a familiar space became a controlled environment where every room carried uncertainty. The victims were not strangers to one another, but they were strangers to what was unfolding around them. The invasion did not end quickly. The Carr brothers remained inside the home for hours. During that time, the victims were held captive, forced to comply, and subjected to repeated violence. The house ceased to function as a place of shelter. It became a place of confinement, where walls that once offered privacy now limited escape. At one point, the brothers forced some of the victims into a vehicle. They were driven away from the house to a nearby soccer field. The removal expanded the crime beyond the home, but it did not lessen its grip. 2 of the victims were killed there. The violence that began inside the house followed them into the open, showing that there was no boundary where it would stop. The remaining victims were driven back to the house. Inside, the invasion continued. The brothers did not flee. They did not hurry. They remained inside the home, extending control over the space and the people within it. The prolonged nature of the crime became one of its most defining elements. This was not a sudden burst of violence. It was sustained domination. Eventually, the Carr brothers left. When the crime was discovered, Wichita was shaken. The scale of the violence, the duration of the invasion, and the number of victims left the community struggling to comprehend what had happened inside an otherwise ordinary house. Investigators moved quickly. The amount of time the brothers spent inside the home left behind extensive evidence. The house itself became central to reconstructing the night. Rooms showed signs of restraint. Movement through the space could be traced. The sequence of events became clearer as evidence was processed. Witness testimony and physical evidence pointed directly to Reginald and Jonathan Carr. Their involvement was not speculative, it was concrete. The brothers were arrested without incident. At trial, prosecutors presented a detailed account of the night. They described how the house was entered, how control was established, and how the victims were held inside for hours. Jurors heard how the home was used as a tool, a place where exits were controlled, and fear dictated every movement. Medical experts testified about the injuries sustained by the victims. 2 people were killed. Others survived but carried injuries and trauma that would last a lifetime. The court avoided sensational language, but the severity of the harm was undeniable. The defense attempted to separate the brothers, suggesting differing levels of responsibility. They argued that Jonathan Carr had followed Reginald's lead, that he was less culpable. Prosecutors rejected that claim, pointing to evidence that both brothers actively participated in the crimes and continued the violence when there were opportunities to stop. The jury agreed. Reginald Carr and Jonathan Carr were convicted of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. Both were sentenced to death. For the survivors, the invasion did not end with the arrests. The house could not return to what it had been. Rooms that once felt neutral became reminders of confinement. Doors that once closed for comfort now carried different meaning. The case left a lasting mark on Wichita. It altered how safety was understood inside familiar walls, showing how quickly control could replace comfort. Years later, in a different state, another offender would rely not on force or duration, but on patience, a different home, a quieter entry, and a crime that would unfold while the victim slept. California, 2001 through 2008. The first house did not raise alarms afterward. There was no forced entry, no shattered window, no sign that someone had ever been inside. That absence of disturbance would become part of the problem. Michael Gargiulo did not choose his locations at random. He chose places he could study. Apartment buildings with predictable rhythms, neighborhoods where nights settled into silence at the same hour, homes where routines repeated until they could be anticipated. In 2001, Ashley Ellerin was living in Los Angeles. She was young, social, and active. On the night she was killed, she had plans to go out later. She never made it. At some point that evening, Gargiulo entered her apartment. Investigators later found no evidence of forced entry. That detail mattered. It suggested access gained through familiarity or observation, not panic or desperation. Inside the apartment, the violence unfolded in close quarters. Concentrated almost entirely in the bedroom, Ashley Ellerin was attacked with a knife. Medical testimony later confirmed that she suffered multiple stab wounds inflicted at close range. The injuries were severe and sustained. This was not a single moment of violence. It was an attack that continued until it ended her life inside her own home. When her body was discovered, the apartment appeared otherwise untouched. Valuables remained. Furniture was undisturbed. The crime was not about theft or confrontation. It was about entry and control. At the time, the case went unsolved. Years passed. In 2005, another home was entered in Los Angeles. Michelle Murphy was asleep in her apartment when Gargiulo came inside. Like before, there were no obvious signs of forced entry. The intrusion relied on silence and familiarity. Murphy woke to find someone already in her bedroom. The attack began immediately. She was stabbed multiple times. But this time, the outcome changed. Murphy fought back. She resisted with everything she had, creating noise and movement that disrupted the attack. Gargiulo fled the apartment, leaving behind blood and evidence. Michelle Murphy survived. Her survival became critical. She provided investigators with a first-hand account of the intruder and the attack. The blood left behind in her apartment was preserved. At the time, forensic technology was still evolving, but the evidence would later become decisive. Still, Gargiulo remained free. In 2008, another life was taken. Tricia Pacaccio was attacked outside her apartment in Los Angeles. While the location differed slightly, the method did not. Gargiulo attacked with a knife at close range. The violence was sudden and fatal. Pacaccio died from her injuries. This time, investigators began to connect the cases. Advances in DNA analysis allowed evidence from multiple scenes to be compared. The blood left behind during Michelle Murphy's attack matched samples connected to the other crimes. The pattern of entry, location, and method formed a clear link. Michael Gargiulo became the focus. He lived near several of the crime scenes. He had been present in the areas around the time of the attacks. Forensic evidence placed him inside homes where he did not belong. The connection between the crimes tightened with each analysis. Gargiulo was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the private nature of the crimes. Gargiulo did not attack in public. He entered homes. He targeted bedrooms. He relied on sleep and routine to isolate his victims. The lack of forced entry was presented as evidence of planning rather than coincidence. Medical experts testified about the injuries in careful clinical language. They focused on proximity, repetition, and duration. The violence was not accidental. It was sustained. Michelle Murphy testified in court. Her account described waking to an intruder, the confusion, the fear, and the struggle to survive. Her testimony connected the cases in a way that evidence alone could not. She had lived through what others did not. The defense challenged aspects of the forensic evidence and timeline, but the DNA links were strong. The sequence of events across years showed consistency rather than randomness. The jury convicted Michael Gargiulo of first-degree murder for the killings of Ashley Ellerin and Tricia Pacaccio, and attempted murder for the attack on Michelle Murphy. He was sentenced to death. For the families, the verdict did not undo what had happened inside those homes. Bedrooms once associated with privacy became places of memory and loss. The knowledge that someone could enter so quietly and leave so little disturbance altered how those spaces were remembered. Gargiulo's crimes revealed another form of intrusion, one that did not rely on speed or chaos, but on repetition, on studying routines, on waiting for the moment when a home became predictable. The attack stretched across years, connected not by location alone, but by method. Each crime built on the last, growing more confident as time passed. As the courtroom proceedings ended, the timeline moved forward again. Because while these attacks were unfolding in California, another crime was already forming elsewhere, one driven not by repetition, but by fixation. A case where familiarity did not come from observation, but from a relationship that had already ended. A different house, a different kind of access, and a night that would end behind a closed bathroom door. Northampton, Massachusetts. May 27, 2013. The last case unfolded across years. This one unfolded inside a single night. By the spring of 2013, Nathaniel Fujita's relationship with Lauren Astley was over. The separation was not recent, but it remained unresolved in his mind. Friends later described a pattern of fixation and resentment that lingered long after the relationship ended. Fujita struggled to accept the boundary that had been set. He continued to feel entitled to access that no longer existed. Lauren Astley lived alone in her home in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was a space she controlled, a place where she felt independent and secure. Fujita had been there before during their relationship. He knew the layout. He knew how sound traveled through the house. He knew which rooms were tight and which offered temporary distance. That familiarity mattered. On May 27, 2013, Fujita entered her home. There was no forced break in that alerted neighbors or drew attention. He relied on access that came from prior knowledge rather than brute force. The entry was quiet. By the time Astley realized someone was inside, the distance between safety and danger had already collapsed. What followed happened in close quarters. Fujita attacked Lauren Astley with a knife. Medical testimony later confirmed that she was stabbed multiple times. The injuries were severe and sustained, requiring proximity and repeated motion. This was not a brief confrontation. It unfolded across rooms as Astley attempted to escape. Blood evidence later showed movement through the house. She ran. She tried to put distance between herself and the attacker. She moved through spaces that once felt familiar, now narrowing with every step. The home became a confined path with no exit. each room offering only momentary delay. The attack ended in the bathroom. There, the violence reached its conclusion. Astley collapsed from her injuries and died inside a room meant for privacy and protection. The small space offered no refuge, the walls closed in. The home failed her completely. After the attack, Fujita did not flee immediately. He remained inside the house long enough to attempt to conceal what he had done. He changed clothes. He tried to clean blood from surfaces. He wiped areas where his presence would be obvious. These actions mattered. They showed awareness and control after the violence had already ended. He then left the house. In an effort to redirect suspicion, Fujita staged injuries on himself. He inflicted wounds and sought medical attention, presenting himself as the victim of an unrelated assault. The story was designed to place him elsewhere and create confusion before investigators could establish a timeline. It did not succeed. When police began examining Lauren Astley's home, the scene contradicted Fujita's account almost immediately. The lack of forced entry suggested familiarity. Blood patterns did not match his explanation. The timeline he offered conflicted with physical evidence. Each inconsistency narrowed the focus back to him. Investigators also examined Fujita's movements before and after the attack. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements placed him near Astley's home at critical times. His behavior following the crime raised additional concerns. Rather than showing confusion or shock, he appeared focused on managing perception. Officers later testified that his emotional responses did not align with the account he initially gave. As evidence accumulated, the investigation shifted from broad inquiry to direct confrontation. The case tightened not through a single revelation, but through a steady accumulation of details that left no room for an alternative explanation. When investigators confronted Fujita with these contradictions, he confessed. At trial, prosecutors laid out the sequence carefully. They described the end of the relationship, the fixation that followed, and the deliberate decision to enter Astley's home without permission. This was not an argument that escalated. It was a choice made before the door was opened. Medical experts testified about the injuries using controlled language. They explained that the wounds required repeated motion and close contact. The attack continued until Astley could no longer resist. The defense raised arguments related to emotional distress and mental health. Psychological evaluations were introduced, but the jury returned to the same core facts. A former partner entered a private home. He carried a weapon. He inflicted fatal injuries. He attempted to erase what he had done. Nathaniel Fujita was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Lauren Astley's family, the home became inseparable from loss. A place once associated with independence and safety was permanently altered. The knowledge that the attacker was someone she once trusted deepened the damage. The case left a lasting impression on the community. It forced difficult conversations about boundaries, access, and how easily familiarity can become vulnerability. It showed that danger does not always arrive from the outside. In the years that followed, another case would raise a different and equally disturbing question. What if the person entering the home was not driven by history or obsession, but by curiosity? What if age offered no restraint? And what if violence arrived from someone who simply wanted to know what it felt like? That answer would come from a quiet street in California. Davis, California. April 14th, 2013. The street was quiet in the early morning hours, the kind of quiet that suggests nothing unusual has ever happened there. The home on Cowell Boulevard in Davis, California belonged to Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup. They were adults living an ordinary life, settled into routines that felt predictable and safe. The neighborhood was calm. The house did not appear vulnerable. There were no alarms, no signs of fear, no reason to believe that anyone inside was in danger. On April 14, 2013, that sense of normalcy was destroyed. Daniel Marsh lived nearby. He knew the area. He knew the house. He had been inside before. This was not a stranger approaching an unfamiliar door. It was someone who understood the layout, the timing, and the silence that came with early morning hours. Marsh was 15 years old. That fact would shock the community later. But on that night, age did not slow him down or introduce hesitation. Investigators would later determine that the crime was not impulsive. It was deliberate, planned, thought about long before it happened. In the early hours of the morning, Marsh entered the home. There was no forced break in that alerted neighbors or woke the occupants. He moved inside quietly, relying on familiarity rather than force. Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup were asleep in their bedroom, unaware that someone had crossed into their home. What followed happened quickly and violently. Marsh attacked both victims while they slept. Medical testimony later confirmed that the injuries were severe and sustained. This was not a single strike. It was repeated violence carried out in close quarters, leaving little opportunity for resistance. The bedroom became the center of the crime, a confined space where the attack unfolded without warning. Neither victim survived. The violence ended as abruptly as it began. The house returned to silence. No alarms sounded. No neighbors were alerted. From the outside, nothing appeared out of place. Marsh left the house. When the crime was discovered later that morning, the scene inside told a different story. Investigators found clear evidence of a violent home invasion. The attack was focused. There was no sign of theft, no attempt to disguise the purpose of the intrusion. The violence was the point. Police began reconstructing how someone could enter a home, kill two people, and leave without immediate detection. Attention quickly turned to someone familiar with the house. Daniel Marsh did not attempt to disappear after the crime. He spoke to others. He returned to normal routines. But his behavior began to raise alarms. He made comments about the murders that suggested fascination rather than shock. He spoke about violence in ways that unsettled those who heard him. When police questioned Marsh, his demeanor stood out. He showed little emotional response. Over time, he made statements that placed him inside the house. Physical evidence supported those admissions. The case against him formed quickly. What disturbed investigators most were Marsh's explanations. He spoke openly about curiosity, about wanting to know what it felt like to kill. He described the act not as a loss of control, but as an experience he wanted to have. Those statements became central to understanding the crime. Because Marsh was a juvenile, the legal process initially followed a different path. But the severity of the offense forced the court to confront a difficult question. How does the system respond when extreme violence enters a home, carried out by someone so young, with full awareness of what they were doing? Psychological evaluations revealed a deeply troubling picture. Experts testified that Marsh understood the difference between right and wrong. He knew the consequences. He was not acting in confusion or panic. He simply did not feel empathy for the victims. The court ruled that Marsh would be tried as an adult. At trial, prosecutors focused on planning and intent. They described how Marsh entered the home, knowing the occupants were asleep, knowing they would be defenseless. This was not a confrontation. It was an invasion. Medical experts testified about the injuries in careful, factual language. They explained that the wounds required repeated motion and close contact. The violence did not stop until both victims were dead. The defense raised arguments related to mental health and age. They argued that Marsh's youth and psychological condition should mitigate the sentence, but the jury returned to the same facts. A home was entered without permission. Two people were attacked while asleep. The violence was deliberate and sustained. Daniel Marsh was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families of Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup, the house could never be separated from what happened inside it. A place that once represented stability became a permanent reminder of loss. The knowledge that the attacker was someone so young added another layer of disbelief. The case sent shockwaves through Davis. It challenged assumptions not just about safety, but about who is capable of extreme violence. The idea that age alone could serve as a barrier collapsed. This crime was not driven by history or obsession. It was driven by curiosity, by a desire to experience violence inside a space where people felt safest. As the legal process concluded in California, the timeline continued to move forward. In another part of the country, a different home invasion would unfold, one driven not by curiosity, but by control. A crime that would begin with a fire and end with an entire family gone. Washington District of Columbia, May 14, 2015. The fire was already visible when the first emergency calls came in. Flames pushed through the windows. Smoke rose above the neighborhood. What initially appeared to be a tragic house fire would soon reveal something far more deliberate. The home belonged to the Savopoulos family. It stood in an affluent part of Washington District of Columbia, surrounded by other large residences and guarded by the assumption that wealth, security systems, and routine could keep danger outside. Inside lived Savas Savopoulos, his wife Amy, and their young son Philip. It was a home built around family life and structure, not fear. On May 14, 2015, that structure collapsed. Darren Wint did not arrive as a stranger. He had previously worked for the family and knew the house. He understood its layout, its entry points, and the rhythms of the people who lived there. That familiarity mattered. It allowed him to move inside without drawing immediate suspicion. Earlier that day, Wint entered the Savopoulos home. What followed was not a quick intrusion. It was a prolonged ordeal that unfolded over several hours. Investigators later determined that the family was restrained inside their own home. They were moved through rooms they knew intimately, now under threat. The house became a controlled environment where every familiar corner worked against them. Wint demanded money. Savas Savopoulos was forced to contact his bank and arrange a series of transfers. Over the course of the day, large sums of money were moved. Financial records later showed that millions of dollars were transferred as the family complied in an attempt to survive. Compliance did not bring safety. As the day wore on, the violence escalated. Savas Savopoulos and his son, Philip, were killed inside the home. Medical testimony later confirmed that their deaths were the result of blunt force trauma and stab wounds. The violence occurred in close quarters, within the same walls that had once been a place of security. Amy Savopoulos was still alive. She was forced into a vehicle and driven away from the house. The removal extended the crime beyond the home, but it did not end the danger. Hours later, the vehicle was found abandoned in another part of the city. Inside was Amy Savopoulos' body. She had been stabbed. The violence followed her even after she left the house. Back at the Savopoulos residence, Wint set a fire. The blaze was intentional. Accelerants were used. The fire was meant to destroy evidence and erase what had happened inside. Instead, it drew immediate attention. Firefighters arrived expecting a house fire. They entered and discovered the bodies of Savas and Philip Savopoulos. The realization came quickly. This was not an accident. It was the aftermath of a home invasion that had turned into murder. The city reacted with shock. A prominent family had been targeted inside their own home, in the middle of the day, in a neighborhood that believed itself insulated from that kind of violence. Investigators launched an intensive search. Surveillance footage, cell phone records, financial data, and witness statements were analyzed rapidly. Attention turned almost immediately to Darren Wint. He had been seen entering and leaving the area. He was captured on video, withdrawing money connected to the ransom. His connection to the family provided both motive and access. The evidence aligned quickly. Wint fled the area, but was arrested days later in Maryland. He was extradited back to Washington District of Columbia to face charges. At trial, prosecutors laid out the timeline in detail. They described how Wint used his prior employment to gain access, how the family was restrained, and how the ransom was extracted. They emphasized that even after receiving millions of dollars, Wint chose to continue the violence. Medical experts testified about the causes of death using controlled language. The separation of the family became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. A father and child killed inside the home. A mother removed only to be killed later. The defense attempted to challenge aspects of the prosecution's narrative, but the volume of evidence was overwhelming. Financial records traced the ransom. Surveillance footage followed Wint's movements. Witnesses placed him at key locations throughout the day. The jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, arson, and related charges. Darren Wint was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Savopoulos family's relatives, the home was gone in every sense. Destroyed by fire, destroyed by memory. A place once associated with stability and success became inseparable from loss. This case challenged another assumption about home invasion, that compliance guarantees survival, that violence ends once demands are met. In this case, compliance only prolonged the ordeal. The Savopoulos home was not entered at night. It was not breached in panic. It was entered deliberately during the day by someone who already knew the way inside. As Washington struggled to absorb what had happened, the timeline continued forward. Another home invasion was coming, another house where familiarity would not be the key, a case defined not by access or ransom, but by sheer persistence. Ontario, Canada, 2009. By the time this next home was entered, the offender was already living a carefully constructed double life. Russell Williams was not drifting on the margins of society. He was a highly ranked colonel in the Canadian Air Force, trusted with authority, leadership, and national responsibility. He lived in well-kept neighborhoods, wore a uniform that commanded respect, and moved through professional spaces where discipline and order were expected. Nothing about his public life suggested danger. Behind closed doors, something else was taking shape. For years leading up to 2009, Williams had been breaking into homes across Ontario. These were not chaotic burglaries. They were calculated intrusions. He selected houses where routines were predictable. He entered while occupants slept. He moved quietly, often spending extended time inside without being detected. The goal was not theft. Williams took personal items, clothing, intimate belongings, objects that confirmed he had been there. He photographed himself inside the homes, documenting the invasion. The violation itself was the purpose. Each break-in reinforced his sense of control. Over time, that control was no longer enough. In 2009, the pattern escalated from intrusion to violence. On November 27, 2009, Williams entered the home of Jessica Lloyd in Tweed, Ontario. Lloyd lived alone in a rural area where nights were quiet and neighbors were distant. Williams had been watching her. He knew her schedule. He knew when the house would be silent. There was no forced entry. Williams entered without resistance and confronted Lloyd inside her home. What followed was not a sudden act. It was an escalation built on years of rehearsal. He restrained her, controlled her movements, and asserted dominance over the space she lived in. Medical testimony later confirmed that Lloyd was killed inside her home. The violence occurred at close range, after prolonged restraint. The home became a controlled environment where escape was impossible. Williams left the scene and attempted to distance himself from the crime. Weeks later, another home was entered. On December 30th, 2009, Williams broke into the home of Marie-France Comeau in Trenton, Ontario. The method was familiar: quiet entry, control, no immediate signs of forced access. Comeau was attacked and killed inside her home. The similarities between the two cases were unmistakable. At this point, the crimes could no longer be dismissed as isolated. Law enforcement launched a focused investigation. Tire tracks found near one of the scenes were preserved. Surveillance footage from nearby locations was reviewed. DNA evidence began to connect the cases not only to each other, but to earlier unsolved break-ins across the region. The trail led somewhere unexpected, to Russell Williams. Investigators uncovered a pattern that stretched back years. Dozens of home invasions were linked to him. Each entry followed the same structure: quiet neighborhoods, nighttime access, occupants asleep. The homes were not chosen randomly. They were studied. When Williams was arrested, the contrast was striking. A senior military officer, calm and articulate, now confronted with evidence tying him to crimes committed in bedrooms and hallways while victims slept. During interrogation, Williams confessed. He described the entries in detail: how he selected homes, how he moved through rooms without waking anyone, how the sense of control intensified over time. His account was methodical, not emotional. He showed no confusion about what he had done. At trial, prosecutors emphasized progression. Williams began with unauthorized entry. He learned how to navigate private spaces without detection. Over time, the invasion itself lost its impact. He sought greater control. That control eventually extended to people, not just homes. Medical experts testified about the causes of death using controlled, factual language. They explained that the violence was not spontaneous. It followed restraint. It followed planning. It followed familiarity with the space. The court also heard extensive evidence about the earlier home invasions. Each break-in was presented as part of a trajectory, not separate acts, but steps toward escalation. The homes were rehearsal spaces. Williams pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. For the families of Jessica Lloyd and Marie-France Comeau, the knowledge that the offender was someone trusted by society added another layer of shock. The homes could never be separated from what had happened inside them. Ordinary rooms became permanent reminders of violation. The case deeply affected communities across Ontario. It challenged assumptions about who poses danger and how that danger presents itself. Williams did not fit the image people expected. He relied on respectability, routine, and silence. This case revealed how intrusion can evolve, how repeated violations of private space can become normalized to the offender, how control over a home can turn into control over a life. And it revealed something else. That danger does not always look dangerous. As Canada absorbed the reality of who Russell Williams was behind closed doors, the timeline continued to move forward. Another home invasion was coming. One involving more than one attacker. One where planning would give way to chaos, and one that would leave an entire household destroyed before morning. Cheshire, Connecticut, July 23, 2007. The neighborhood was quiet enough that night for small sounds to carry. Crickets, distant traffic, a television playing behind a closed window. The Petit family home stood like any other on the street, well kept, familiar. A place shaped by routine and comfort. Inside lived William Petit, his wife Jennifer Hawk Petit, and their daughters Haley and Michaela. It was a home built around ordinary life, schedules, and the belief that once the doors were locked, nothing from the outside could reach them. On July 23, 2007, that belief was shattered. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky were not strangers to the area. They moved through the neighborhood without drawing attention, blending into the silence rather than disrupting it. In the early morning hours, they entered the Petit home. There was no forced entry loud enough to wake the family. Once inside, control was immediate. William Petit was confronted first. He was restrained and moved through his own home under threat. What had been a familiar space became a controlled environment where every room was dictated by fear rather than routine. Jennifer Hawk Petit and her daughters were awakened next. The invasion did not end quickly. Hayes and Komisarjevsky remained inside the house for hours. During that time, the family was held captive, forced to comply with demands, and moved from room to room. The house ceased to be a refuge. It became a place where exits were meaningless and privacy no longer existed. Money became part of the crime. William Petit was forced to go with one of the attackers to a local bank. Surveillance footage later confirmed his presence there early that morning, attempting to withdraw funds under duress. The effort was limited by bank restrictions, and the amount obtained fell short of what the attackers wanted. When William Petit was brought back to the house, the atmosphere shifted. The failure to obtain more money did not end the invasion. It escalated it. Jennifer Hawk Petit was killed inside the home. Medical testimony later confirmed that the violence occurred in close quarters, within a space where she had no opportunity to escape. Her death happened while her daughters were still alive inside the house. The girls were moved upstairs. Haley and Michaela Petit were taken to their bedrooms and restrained. The confinement of the space mattered. The rooms that once held safety and childhood familiarity now offered no protection. The violence that followed occurred behind closed doors, isolated from the outside world. After hours inside the home, Hayes and Komisarjevsky set a fire. Accelerants were used. The fire was deliberate. It spread quickly through the house, trapping the girls inside. Firefighters later testified that the intensity of the blaze left little chance for survival. William Petit managed to escape. Injured and disoriented, he fled to a neighbor's home and called for help. By the time emergency responders arrived, the house was fully engulfed. Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela Petit were dead. The discovery of what happened inside the home sent shockwaves through Connecticut and beyond. The brutality of the crime, the length of the invasion, and the involvement of children made it almost impossible to comprehend. Investigators worked quickly. Evidence from the home, the bank, surveillance footage, and witness testimony formed a clear timeline. Hayes and Komisarjevsky were arrested within days. At trial, prosecutors emphasized duration and control. This was not a sudden act of violence. It was an invasion that lasted hours. The home was used as a place of confinement. Compliance did not bring safety. It prolonged the ordeal. Medical experts testified about the causes of death using careful, factual language. Fire investigators explained how the blaze was started and why escape was impossible. Every element of the crime pointed back to deliberate decisions made over time. The defense attempted to shift blame between the two men, arguing differing levels of responsibility. Prosecutors rejected that argument, presenting evidence that both actively participated in the invasion and its escalation. The jury returned guilty verdicts. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky were sentenced to death. In later years, their sentences were converted to life in prison, without the possibility of parole following changes to Connecticut law. For William Petit, survival did not bring closure. The home was gone, the family was gone, the space that once represented safety had become inseparable from loss. The Cheshire case permanently altered how people understood home invasion. It showed that danger could enter quietly, remain for hours, and escalate even when victims complied. It challenged the belief that cooperation ensures survival. This was not a crime defined by speed, it was defined by time. As Connecticut struggled to process the scale of what had happened, the timeline continued forward, because the final case would return to a familiar pattern. A house entered while its occupants slept, a quiet street, and a crime that would unfold in minutes, not hours. Moscow, Idaho. November 13, 2022. The house on King Road did not look dangerous. It was a student rental, one of many in a quiet neighborhood near the University of Idaho. Cars lined the street, lights came and went at all hours. Noise was normal, people came and left without question. It was a place defined by youth, routine, and the belief that nothing truly bad could happen there. In the early hours of November 13, 2022, that belief failed. Inside the house were 4 students, Kaylee Gunkovs, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They had returned home after a night out. Messages were sent, lights went off. By the early morning, the house was quiet. Bryan Kohberger arrived while the occupants slept. Investigators later determined that Kohberger had driven past the house multiple times in the months leading up to the murders. Cell phone data and surveillance footage showed repeated presence in the area. This was not a random encounter. The house had been noticed. The routine had been observed. Shortly after 4 in the morning, Kohberger entered the home. There was no forced entry loud enough to alert the entire house. The door was not broken down. The intrusion relied on timing, silence, and the assumption that no one inside would be prepared to respond. What followed unfolded in minutes. Kohberger moved through the house, entering bedrooms where occupants were asleep. The attacks were sudden and violent. Medical testimony later confirmed that all 4 victims were stabbed. The injuries were severe and sustained, inflicted at close range. This was not a single act carried out in one place. It was movement, room to room, floor to floor. Kaylee Gunkovs and Madison Mogan were attacked in an upstairs bedroom. Evidence showed they were in the same room, asleep when the attack began. The confined space offered no escape. The violence was immediate. On the second floor, Zana Kernodle was awake. Evidence suggested she encountered Kohberger. There were signs of movement, a struggle. Her bedroom became another crime scene. Ethan Chapin was also killed there. The entire sequence happened quickly. A surviving roommate later reported seeing a masked figure inside the house. She did not immediately understand what she was seeing. Fear did not register as danger in the moment. The intruder left the house shortly afterward. By the time police were called later that morning, the violence was already over. Inside the house, investigators found a scene that defied initial understanding. 4 victims, multiple locations, no clear sign of forced entry. The absence of immediate alarms raised questions about how someone could enter, kill 4 people, and leave unnoticed. The investigation moved fast. Surveillance footage from nearby homes captured a white vehicle driving through the area around the time of the murders. Cell phone records placed Kohberger's phone near the house repeatedly in the weeks before the crime, and then showed it inactive during the critical window that night. A knife sheath found at the scene became a key piece of evidence. DNA recovered from it matched Kohberger. That detail would later anchor the case. When Kohberger was arrested in Pennsylvania weeks later, the narrative came into focus. A criminology student, a man studying criminal behavior, someone who understood investigative methods but still chose to enter a home and commit extreme violence. At trial, prosecutors emphasized speed and intent. This was not a prolonged invasion. It was efficient, targeted. The house was entered while its occupants slept. The crime unfolded in minutes, not hours. Medical experts testified about the injuries using careful language. They explained that the wounds required repeated motion and close proximity. The violence did not occur from a distance. It required contact. The defense challenged aspects of the evidence, including timelines and interpretations of cell data. But the combination of physical evidence, digital records, and surveillance formed a consistent picture. For the families, the house on King Road could never be separated from what happened inside it. A place meant for student life became a symbol of sudden loss. The randomness of the location made the crime feel closer to home for communities far beyond Moscow. This case closed the timeline of this documentary in the present day, but it also echoed everything that came before it: a door not fully secured, a routine assumed to be safe, a home entered quietly. From 1978 to 2022, the details changed, the people changed, the methods evolved, but the core violation remained the same. Evil did not wait outside, it stepped inside. And for every house in this series, the moment the door was crossed was the moment everything changed. These stories are not connected by location, age, or motive. They are connected by one shared belief: that home is where danger stops. Each case proves how fragile that belief can be. If you've watched this far, thank you for trusting me with these stories. And before you go, let me ask you something simple. Where are you watching from tonight?